Cognitive biases shape the way we think, make decisions, and interpret the world around us, often without us even realizing it. These mental shortcuts help us process information quickly, but they also lead to systematic errors in judgment. Why do we fall for them, and how can we avoid making poor decisions because of them? One of the most well-known biases is the confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Have you ever noticed how people tend to follow news sources that align with their opinions? This happens because the brain prefers consistency. It avoids cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding conflicting ideas. While this bias can provide mental stability, it also prevents people from considering alternative viewpoints, leading to closed-mindedness and polarization. Another common bias is the availability heuristic, where people judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall similar cases. For example, if you hear frequent news reports about plane crashes, you might start thinking air travel is extremely dangerous, even though statistically it's far safer than driving. The brain prioritizes memorable, emotionally charged events over actual probability, which can distort decision-making. The anchoring effect influences financial and everyday choices. When making decisions, we often rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if it's arbitrary. Have you ever seen a product advertised as 50% off and felt like you were getting a great deal even though you never checked if the original price was fair? This happens because the initial number, the anchor, shapes our perception of value even when it's irrelevant. Another dangerous bias is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with little knowledge about a topic overestimate their expertise. Beginners in a subject often feel overly confident because they lack the depth to recognize what they don't know. Ironically, true experts are more likely to doubt themselves, as they understand the vastness of their field. This bias is particularly problematic in science, medicine, and decision-making, where overconfidence can lead to disastrous consequences. What about group decisions? The bandwagon effect makes people more likely to adopt a belief or behavior just because many others do. This is why trends spread so quickly and why misinformation can go viral. Even if an idea is flawed, social validation makes it feel correct. This bias explains stock market bubbles, viral hoaxes, and even why certain fashion trends take off. So how can we guard against cognitive biases? One effective strategy is metacognition, thinking about our thinking. When making a decision, ask, am I considering all the evidence or just what supports my belief? Am I being influenced by emotions instead of logic? Is my judgment being shaped by irrelevant information like an initial price or a vivid memory? Another approach is deliberate exposure to opposing viewpoints. If you only read sources that confirm your beliefs, try looking at counterarguments. Seeking diverse perspectives forces the brain to evaluate information more critically, reducing bias. Developing statistical literacy also helps. Understanding probability and risk can counteract the availability heuristic, preventing irrational fears based on dramatic but rare events. For example, knowing the actual odds of winning the lottery might stop someone from wasting money on tickets. Cognitive biases are part of being human, but recognizing them gives us an advantage. By training ourselves to think critically and question our own assumptions, we can make better decisions, avoid manipulation, and improve problem-solving skills. The more aware we are of these mental traps, the more control we gain over our thoughts and actions. Confirmation bias is the tendency to favor information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. This happens because the brain prioritizes cognitive efficiency, filtering out complex or opposing data to maintain mental stability. Neurological studies show that when people encounter supporting evidence, the reward centers of the brain activate, reinforcing their confidence. This bias affects scientific research, business decisions, and everyday thinking, leading to rigid and sometimes irrational beliefs. A person who believes a certain diet works will only read success stories and ignore studies showing mixed or negative results. This is like watching only one news channel that aligns with your views while ignoring alternative perspectives. The anchoring bias occurs when people give disproportionate weight to the first piece of information they receive. This is due to how memory and expectation formation work in the brain, with the first exposure creating a cognitive reference point. Even when presented with new data, people subconsciously adjust their perceptions around the initial anchor, rather than evaluating information objectively. This bias impacts negotiations, pricing strategies, and investment decisions. If a car dealer first offers a high price, any later discount appears more reasonable, even if it's still overpriced. This is like setting a large rock in a stream. The water will always flow around it instead of resetting the path. People tend to judge the probability of an event based on how easily they can recall similar occurrences. This happens because the brain retrieves memories based on emotional intensity, frequency, and recent exposure rather than statistical reality. As a result, people overestimate the likelihood of dramatic but rare events and underestimate common, less sensational risks. This bias affects perceptions of crime rates, health risks, and personal safety. After seeing multiple news reports about plane crashes, a person might become afraid of flying even though car accidents are far more frequent. This is like thinking shark attacks are a major danger just because movies and the news make them seem common. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with limited knowledge or skill in a subject overestimate their expertise. This happens because individuals lack the ability to recognize their own incompetence, leading them to feel more confident than they should. Studies show that as expertise increases, people become more aware of knowledge gaps, reducing overconfidence. This bias affects self-assessments in academics, business, and leadership. A novice chess player may believe they can beat experienced opponents after winning a few casual games. This is like a child believing they can drive a car just because they've played a racing video game. The sunk cost fallacy occurs when people persist in a failing course of action simply because they have already invested time, money, or effort. This bias is rooted in loss aversion, where the brain experiences losses more intensely than equivalent gains. The rational decision would be to evaluate future benefits objectively, but emotional attachment makes abandoning a failing investment difficult. This impacts business projects, relationships, and career decisions. A person continues watching a boring 3-hour movie just because they already spent an hour on it. This is like staying on a sinking ship just because you've already paid for the ticket. The halo effect happens when a positive impression in one area influences judgments in unrelated areas. This bias occurs because the brain likes to create simple, consistent images of people and objects rather than process complex, nuanced evaluations. It can lead to flawed hiring decisions, misleading brand perceptions, and biased court judgments. Studies show this effect is especially strong when people make quick decisions. A charismatic politician might be assumed to be competent in policymaking, even if they lack experience. This is like assuming a beautifully wrapped gift must contain something valuable inside. The framing effect occurs when people react differently to the same information depending on how it is presented. The brain is more sensitive to potential losses than equivalent gains, making wording and context crucial in shaping decisions. Marketing, political messaging, and medical communication all exploit this bias by emphasizing positive or negative perspectives. Even experienced professionals are influenced by framing effects in decision-making. A surgery described as having a 90% survival rate seems safer than one described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though both are the same. This is like preferring a half-full glass over a half-empty one, even though they contain the same amount of liquid. The gambler's fallacy occurs when people believe that past random events influence future probabilities, even when events are statistically independent. This happens because the brain tries to find patterns in randomness, a survival mechanism that works well in nature but fails in probability-based situations. This bias leads to poor financial decisions, irrational gambling behavior, and superstitious beliefs. A gambler believes a coin is due to land on heads after landing on tails 5 times in a row, even though the odds remain 50/50. This is like expecting rain just because the sun has been shining for several days in a row. Overcoming cognitive biases requires awareness, critical thinking, and deliberate reasoning strategies. One approach is considering the opposite, actively seeking out and evaluating counterarguments to one's own beliefs. Using data-driven decision-making and slowing down before making choices can help counteract emotional biases. Cognitive training, mindfulness, and exposure to diverse perspectives can reduce the impact of biases over time. Scientists use double-blind experiments to eliminate confirmation bias when testing new drugs. This is like using multiple mirrors to check for blind spots while driving.